I was going to say, as I was sitting here just before the meeting started, I was just thinking there's quite a buzz in the room. I don't know if anyone else felt that. And then when we had that terrible news, which is important to be aware of so we can have it in our minds and our prayers, the mood did change, as you probably all felt. So I just want to acknowledge that, and thank you, David, for your heartfelt prayer. That you can really tell when that comes from the heart. So I just want to preface, based on those events, what I'm going to say, which is an overall positive message, that of course we know God is in control, and sometimes bad things do happen, but ultimately there's that hope that God is in control and all good things will happen from that. So this morning I want to share some brief thoughts that Abby and I had from our daily reading in 1 Kings chapter 17. And right up front, I want to say that I think God is saying to us from this chapter, believe in the impossible. Have faith in me. My grace gives and your faith receives. So my theme this morning is believe in the impossible. In our reading, we learned that Elijah announces to King Ahab on God's behalf that there's going to be a great drought and there's going to be no dew or rain. And as we know, that ended up being for 3.5 years. Well, why was that? Essentially, King Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord, as it says in the previous chapter, than any of those before him. He set up altars to Baal in the temple and made an Asherah pole. So God wanted to send a strong message of dissatisfaction to him, and he did that through Elijah. And after Elijah delivers that message, God directs him to hide in the Kerith ravine, and some people refer to it as Cherith. And this is to avoid the ransom that was on his life. So it was for his safety. So that's why he was at the ravine. And he's fed there by ravens in the morning and in the evening. And he drinks from a brook that's there. So that in itself is a miracle of God's power to sustain Elijah, his sufficiency. And God supplied him food, and from that faith he had the faith to drink from the water and receive it. Anyway, after some time, because of the drought, the brook dried up and there was no rain. So, of course, God is going to provide for Elijah. So God directs Elijah to seek out a specific woman in Zarephath, and that's what we want to draw a couple of key lessons for us and practicalities for us from this morning. So what do we know about Zarephath? Well, we're talking about a Gentile region. And essentially, when the land of Israel is unsafe for Elijah, God directs him to take refuge in a Gentile land that many saw as a heathen region. So, at first glance, not the typical place that you would expect God to send someone. So God sends Elijah to a widow, and we discover that it was at the exact time that her food was almost gone. She was gathering sticks to build a fire to prepare, as Tim read out thoughtfully, a last meal for herself and her son, realizing that soon she and her son would die of starvation. Now, that's easy to read, but imagine that. Imagine that, preparing your last meal. And really I'm struck with God's timing of perfection here. Just take a moment to think about everything that would have to line up exactly for this to happen as it's written. So exactly in their life timelines. So the woman happened to only use the exact amount of flour and oil in the weeks preceding. So it was that exact day that she was going to have only enough for her last meal. And that had to happen at the exact time that Elijah walked up, and that God would have told him in the exact amount of right time beforehand, based on how long the journey was to go and meet this woman in Zarephath. So do you get the point? That there's quite a lot of exact timing in this. And the other thing is, was there only one widow in this whole region that he would just think, I'm going to turn up and I'm going to ask for a widow in this area and they're going to appoint me to her house? I mean, it's not exactly mentioned how that was all going to work. And it seems really strange and amazing and actually quite impossible. But what we read is that Elijah arrives to the town gate and there just happens to be a widow there gathering sticks. So I just wanted to point out that it's only a couple of verses, but there's actually quite a lot of God's work there through his angels occurring. And what does Elijah ask for when he first sees her? And there's a lot of echoes. I'm not going to go into all of them. There's a lot of echoes here. He asks, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I can have a drink?" And then, as she's hospitably going about it to get him a drink, he calls out, this is what it says, he calls out, "Oh, and please bring me some bread." So there's all sorts of echoes here to Jesus asking for water. And of course, we're bringing our minds to the remembrance of Jesus this morning. There's echoes to water and everlasting life. But I just wanted to look at one example which was really striking from Matthew 10. In Matthew 10 and verse 40. And in there, from verses 40 to 42, I'm just going to read what it says because it is amazingly relevant for exactly what we had in 1 Kings 17. In Matthew 10 verse 40, it says, Jesus says, "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives the one who sent me. Whoever receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever receives a righteous man because he is righteous will receive a righteous man's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because he is my disciple, truly I tell you, he will never lose his reward." So this woman's life had certainly changed for the better, as we'll see, because of her response. Now taking a moment to think about us. Abby always says to me, make sure you connect that with us. So what does this look like in our lives today? Our actions have the power to be refreshing for others, like a cup of cold water is on a hot Adelaide summer's day. So this widow's response to Elijah is also interesting. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," and she detected something special about Elijah. His God wasn't hers yet, but that would change. "I don't have any bread," she said, "only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Now, I don't know about you, but every time I read that, or it's read again by Tim so thoughtfully, I get a little bit sad, actually more than a little bit sad. It's quite a sad possible eventuation there. Her food supply was dwindled. She's at her lowest. But God supplies, and with faith she receives. She could have refused to share some of her last meal with this person who turned up at the city gate. And as a result, though, her flour and oil didn't run out until the drought was over. God's grace was sufficient for her needs. And you will have noticed that theme coming through in the songs. And although we might not know the tune, it actually probably causes us to read some of the words even more, so that's fine with me. And you know, the prophet Elijah lived with them for quite some time. This is the other thing that as I was reading through, sort of thought, that's an interesting point. He lived with them for some time and would have got to know them quite well, maybe even a father figure for the child, for the son. We're not told much about her identity. We're not even told her name. So all the attention is focused on what she did rather than who she was. And this is definitely an example of faith in action, as we would say. Another interesting thing to share is that Jesus singles her out in Luke chapter 4. And it's about in a section that we're just going to read from Luke 4, verse 24, where Jesus is being rejected in Nazareth. Luke 4, verse 24. And apologies if I don't go slow enough to allow the turning up. We'll get there. Luke 4, verse 24. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. So that is quite a striking thought, isn't it? He's saying, well, don't you think that there were quite a few widows that he could have been sent to in Israel? But no, God sent him to a Gentile land. And there's a definite foreshadow here to Jesus. Elijah visited the widow in that foreign land. The woman received him into her home and in turn received God's ongoing salvation. And then we have Jesus who comes to find us and bring salvation to our lives. And in Mark 6, verse 6, Jesus clearly states that faith is an enabler for God's power to be demonstrated. We see this in Jesus' experience with miracles in his own hometown. This is a curiosity as well. He couldn't do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them, it says. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Of course, there's all sorts of echoes here to scriptural references, but one from Hebrews 11 stands out, which I'm sure we all know and love. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. So back to the story. The woman was starving. She was more than hungry, and she would have been beyond hangry. She saw the baked beans. This is just a modern day spin, but you'll get the point. She saw the baked beans finished off, the long life milk depleted, the 2-minute noodle stash was no longer. She'd probably said all her prayers and pleaded with God and had come to terms with the inevitable. Then God saves both her and Elijah by supplying for them in that last moment when all seemed lost. Verses 15 and 16 of our reading say, "There was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family, for the jar of flour was not used up and the jug of oil did not run dry." And this was in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Now, after some time, as we progressed through at pace, the widow's son became very ill. It says there was no breath left in him. We learned that the woman was dismayed, I guess you would say, that God would bring this person into her life and her son's life and give them food to eat and then allow the death of her son, which on the surface does seem quite odd. And she is almost intimating that it's a punishment for her lifestyle, for her sin, if you like. As we see, though, God's salvation continues for the woman. It wasn't just one event. By performing the miracle of bringing the widow's son back to life outside of Israel, God was demonstrating that he is the God for all people. Can we relate to that in some way at all? Perhaps we can think of a time in our lives, not that we were physically about to starve or had a loved one brought back to life, but when it seemed all hope was lost, when we thought something was impossible, but then something amazing happened. So some examples to think about. Perhaps you're a teacher and you thought, that child will never get through, but they did. Perhaps you're a student studying for exams and thought, I'll never get there, but you did. Perhaps you've been bold and pitched an idea that you thought would never gain momentum, but eventually it did. Or perhaps you're a medical professional and thought there is no way that patient is going to make it through, but they pulled through. Even more personal for each of us, perhaps you're listening right now thinking, I don't have a clue how God is going to continue working on me. But he is. Perhaps you have unproductive guilt that rears its head every now and then like the widow had. Perhaps you go through waves of varying degrees of faith. Perhaps people you held in esteem haven't lived up to the expectations you once had of them and caused you to think twice about things. Or perhaps, like me, you sometimes limit what is possible with God, even though conceptually you know that with God all things are possible. Why does that happen? That's really a question for me and you individually. Why do we limit possibilities with God, knowing that faith can move mountains? In 2 Kings 6, verses 15 to 17, we have an example of faith overcoming fear. Elisha was with a servant, surrounded by an army with horses and chariots. And this is what his servant said, "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, saying, "Open his eyes, Lord, that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And this is an interesting thought, to pray for God to open our eyes to see and receive his power. Perhaps we can distill things down to simply say, God gives and we receive. We receive through faith, along with biblical characters who received in faith and didn't place limitations on what was possible. For us in today's context of coming to remember Jesus Christ, what does not placing limitations on God's power look like? If this was an interactive session, we'd all have a little talk to our neighbour. Well, it's believing in the salvation being offered. It really is quite that simple. It's believing that with God all things are possible through the sacrifice of his Son. And of course we know that through Jesus we have the promise of eternal life. What about though when you're struggling to accept God's gift of salvation? Well, you can take a leaf from Paul's example in Corinthians that we're going to read. I'm going to read it from the Amplified Version. Paul is essentially tormented by some negative tendencies. But have a listen to God's amazing response when Paul's beating himself up mentally. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10 from the Amplified Bible, just to bring it all out. God's response is to say, his grace is sufficient. But he has said to me, Paul says, my grace is sufficient for you. My loving kindness and my mercy are more than enough, always available, regardless of the situation. For my power is perfected and is completed and shows itself most effectively in your weaknesses. Therefore, I will all the more gladly boast in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may completely enfold me and may dwell in me. So as we wrap up, some thoughts for ourselves to think about. What is our Father's message for us today? What does God give and hopes we receive with faith? Well, I think it's a really positive message, and I'm just going to paraphrase perhaps what God might want us to hear. My power is limitless. When all hope seems lost, I will supply. When you feel insignificant, I'll show individual care as you're my child. When life seems its emptiest, you have a room to appreciate me the most. When you feel like you're not being heard, I'm listening and already have my angels working on a plan for you. Always remember, my grace is sufficient for you.